Franklin Area Historical Society presents Jeffrey Larsh. Jeffrey Larsh brings the American Revolution action to life through his two books, Paul Larsh, An Original Frontiersman, and Frontier Warriors. Larsh is a military veteran and retired law enforcement officer who recently completed his second book, Frontier Warriors. Frontier Warriors takes place on the frontier of southwestern Pennsylvania during the American Revolution. Larsh writes about a unique group of men, expert woodsmen of French and native descent, the Chapeau Brun, known by the British as the Brown Hats. They were led by one of the most accomplished frontiersmen of the time who wants desperately to believe in the promise of America. The frontiersmen met a group of expert fighters, British Army Dragoons, Company C of the Queen's Rangers, and young men from New York, New Jersey, and Canada, led by an English-Welsh officer. Frontier Warriors is a sequel to his 2022 book, Paul Larsh, An Original Frontiersman. A story of enthusiastic and resilient men and women living life to its fullest on the unforgiving frontier of late 18th century North America. Larsh based his first book on a true story about the life of his fifth great-grandfather, with stories passed down through the Larsh family for over 200 years. Having been published in professional journals, Larsh used his experience as an investigator, an understanding of human behavior, and a passion for history to bring this story to life.
I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Larsh. He's a local. His books he's going to tell you about is based on his ancestors that were frontiers people. A little bit east of here, but it's still southern Ohio. He's still a local person, and he's going to tell you all about his books, and I guess that's it.
Well, thank you.
Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, it's an honor and privilege to be here. Thank you. I love doing these kind of things because we all love history, right? So that's a good thing when we get everybody in the same spot that loves history. I'll sell books at different venues, but you never know what you're going to get there, and it's not about selling the books. Actually, they'll sell eventually, so I don't worry about that too much, but it's just the fact of connecting with folks, and I always learn things, and hopefully everybody here can just learn a few things that they didn't know you may find interesting. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about this, really the whole adventure thing that came upon me that brought me to write my first book and then follow up with the second one. So the way that all started was when I was a boy. My dad and my uncles. My dad was the youngest of 7, and him and his older brothers, 2 of them, they're all gone now. All World War II vets, all combat veterans in Second World War. They would take me to family reunions in Xenia. Larsh is the family name. Now, actually, they had these family reunions different places. I've come to find out they were in Indiana. I probably went to one of those when I was very young, but the ones I remember are going up into Xenia. And when I was in Xenia, there was a family historian. His name was Harvey Larsh. And Harvey, I don't know a ton about him. He's been gone for a while now too. But he was, Harvey actually served in the First World War, and he was a correspondent. Well, he was actually a combat troop, and then he was wounded, and then somehow finagled himself to be a sort of a reporter, I guess you would say, before there was such a thing as a war correspondent. Kind of an interesting story. Then he ended up going back. He covered the Spanish Civil War. He was over there for that, and then he was actually over in Europe for the Second World War, not as a troop, but as a correspondent. So he wrote the family history of the Larsh family, and this is a copy of the paper that he would hand out to everybody at the family reunions, and it's called Paul Larsh, founder of the Larsh family in America. So I got this as a boy. I thought, well, that's pretty cool. Folded it up and put it somewhere, and we'd talk about it, family stuff, but I was a kid. So then when I retired, I'm a retired police officer. I decided, I was an investigator for years. I'm like, well, I'm going to investigate this and see what I can find out. So Harvey Larsh was really accurate on things that occurred with the Larsh family. So basically what he wrote about was that there was a young man, his name was Paul Larchevêque. He was French Canadian, and he left the Montreal area when he was 18 years old in 1753. And he traveled by canoe down the waterway, St. Lawrence River, down to present-day United States, down to Lake Erie, Niagara, portaged around the falls, ended up coming down made his way down to the Mississippi River, or the Ohio River, went up to the Mississippi River, or down the Ohio to the Mississippi, up the Mississippi to a place called Fort de Char, which was near a town called Kaskaskia. I don't know if everybody's ever heard of Kaskaskia before or not. Well, that was so we're talking the year 1753. So the year 1753, what was going on? Well, in North America, what was going on was the British, 13 colonies, right? East of the Allegheny Mountains, that was the line. West, where we are now, the Ohio country, as it was called, was really, obviously it was Indian territory, but the European powers that claimed it were Great Britain, France were the two biggies, and of course the Spanish were here, the Dutch, but mostly we're going to talk about the British and the French. So the French had the colony of New France. You'd be amazed how many people never even heard of that. But it was here for 200 years. Canada, Quebec being the big one, Ontario, and then a swath of present-day United States. Basically, the French claimed what they called Upper Louisiana. It was also called the Illinois country. And that's all down basically the Mississippi River Valley, right? And but also this territory too. That's why who was the explorer that planted the plates, claimed a large part of the Ohio country. Somebody help me with my history. So it was a Frenchman back in the early 1700s. LaSalle, thank you. And he planted like Miami town along the Great Miami River. There's plates that he planted, and claiming for the King of France. So, but the French had their colonies. Fort de Char was one of them, Kaskaskia. So what Harvey discovered was that Paul went there. He served about 10 years with the French army. He was a scout. He was a trader, fur trader. Basically, he would take what they did then, coureur de bois they were called, and they would load up canoes, whatever boats they could float, and they would usually a bunch of merchants would get together and they'd pay these guys to trade for furs from the Indians. So the Indians would trap the furs, and of course they became dependent on European goods. So the French and the English would trade amongst the tribes, and they'd get the furs, of course, for the fur trade, which was the biggest trade in North America. The beaver, talking about mostly, they were all trapped out everywhere in Europe, except for some spots in Russia at the time. So North America was it. So that's what Paul did. And in 1756, if you think of it, he was on the Mississippi River, him and his trading partner, a guy named Martin Maltese, he was French Shawnee. They were partners. They traveled, still boggles my mind. Not only that he came when he was 18 years old from up in Canada, all the way down by himself, and somehow didn't get scalped or many things that could have happened to him, died of exposure, whatever. But he didn't. Him and Martin would travel the waterways, and they'd come here. They'd come up the Great Miami River, all the tributaries. They'd visit the Indian villages. And if you think at the time, they were French, and the Shawnee, and the Lenape or Delaware, the Miami, they were all allied with the French. then. And in 1756, after the start of the war, they were in a place called Lower Shawneetown, which is in current Portsmouth, Ohio. So that was a big Shawnee village there. They traded. It was kind of a neutral zone for the British and the French. They would come in there even when the war was on, and they would trade with the Shawnee. The Shawnee kind of, they kind of kept the peace there, so there was no fighting going on there. But Paul was there, and he came upon a woman who had been captured in a raid in near current Warm Springs, Virginia, and her name was Alice Dean Kincaid. And she was what Harvey discovered, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Everything I'm talking to you about, I cross-referenced and I checked it with different places that these things actually occurred. So Paul came upon Alice, and Harvey's original story was that he rescued her and carried her on his back to his canoe and took her back to the Kaskaskia area in Mississippi, on the Mississippi River. So if you think they're in eastern Ohio and they're going to go back down to Fort Deshar, I think he probably traded for her release. I don't think he did some sort of rescue mission with 1,000 Shawnee. Well, there's probably not that many, but several hundred Shawnee in this village. So he probably traded for her release. What I found out was that she had her face painted black, which most of you probably know that meant she was condemned to die. And when they say condemned to die, it usually means being burned alive. It was because she refused to marry into the tribe. I don't know how long she was there. In the book, I didn't have her there very long. She could have been there several months. I'm not really sure. But she was injured, and Paul nursed her back to health, and they ended up falling in love. And she was English, and he was French, and they were on two different sides of the war. And that still amazes me too. He was Catholic, which he later became Protestant, but that's neither here nor there. But my point is, he was French Canadian, he was Catholic, she was Protestant, English. Her father was a British soldier, and they fell in love and they got married. So so I thought, well, that's pretty cool. So I'm following this along, the story along, and I'm going to stop right there because I started doing some genealogy searching, and accompanying that, I have Paul Larsh's last will and testament, dated in 1792 in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. And of course, I won't read the whole thing to you, but the things that's pretty interesting is that Paul Larsh, he anglicized his name to Larsh after the French and Indian War. So Paul wrote his last will and testament, and part of it in here says that I bequeath to my son Charles, which Paul and Alice had one child, Charles Larsh, 1/3 of said plantation. And if everybody knows that when you say plantation, we think of Tara, Gone with the Wind, but that's not. They use that word plantation for farms. My wearing apparel, a large house Bible, and a rifle given to him and his heirs forever. So, remember me telling you my dad was the youngest of 7. My oldest uncle, Edwin Larsh, a few years before he died, said he had something to give me. And this is what he gave me. It's the rifle that Paul bequeathed to him and to his heirs forever. So this has been passed on. Yeah, pretty cool. So this rifle, who here is a muzzle loader or does black powder stuff? Anybody? Okay, you can see, so this rifle was made, it's definitely in the Pennsylvania style. Now, you think about long rifles and you think Daniel Boone, well, this isn't really a long rifle, right? And it is, but it's not like some of them were up here. And it's in the Pennsylvania style, and it has no markings where it was made and what shop. But I know that it was made because Paul, after the French and Indian War, Paul and Alice and a bunch of other ones, which if you read the book, you'll see that I don't want to give a whole lot of it away, but The French had to go somewhere at the end after the war, right? Because the British won, France capitulated. The French were worried that the English were going to come up to Fort Tachar and take that over. That didn't actually happen for 6 or 7 more years, I believe, because they just didn't have the manpower to do it. So my family came east to Pennsylvania, southwest Pennsylvania. A lot of the French did 2 things. They went south to New Orleans or around Lake Pontchartrain, and between them and the Cajuns is why there's such a large French population there. St. Louis had a large French population. A lot of them went there. Some of them just went across the Mississippi River, because the west bank of the Mississippi River, that was claimed by Spain. So the King of Spain, Catholic King of Spain, said all the French citizens that want can come over and they can become subjects of Spain. My family didn't want any part of that. They came east. They didn't come to the colonies because they didn't really want to be under British control either. So they settled just outside the 13 colonies in where they weren't supposed to be, in Indian Territory, in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, which is basically south, about 75 miles south of Pennsylvania, or Pittsburgh. So anyway, you can see that this rifle was made sometime after Paul got to Pennsylvania and before the American Revolution, because he carried it in the Revolution. It's percussion, right? Percussion didn't come around to about 1823. Before that, it was flintlock. Why did they go to percussion? Somebody tell me why they went to percussion?
Much more reliable.
Exactly, much more reliable. So, because flintlock, this originally would have had, if you look here, you can see where it's been cut. So it was converted from flintlock to percussion, probably somewhere in the 1820s, 1830s. I wish it hadn't been, but it was. And a lot of them, they did that. It was a lot cheaper than buying a new rifle, because a rifle like this might cost a year's wages at the time. So it's about 45 caliber. Interestingly enough, it was carried, I know, during the French and Indian War. I'm sorry, during the American Revolution. It was carried during the Northwest Indian Wars. And it was also carried during the War of 1812. Because Charles, their only son, fought in the Northwest Indian Wars with Simon Kenton. And he also fought in the War of 1812. He was at the battle of, I know for a fact he was at the siege of Fort Meigs, where the British had that fort surrounded. Oh, I got that backwards. Yeah, they had the fort surrounded. We sent a bunch of troops up there to try to relieve it. It was unsuccessful, but anyway, it was a big battle up there. But anyway, it's got a bunch of marks on it. I know he was a scout. Whether these are authentic and count for actual kills, I don't know for a fact, but they're there. So yeah, that's a pretty cool piece of history right there. Mm-hmm. One of my boys, whichever one I'm not irritated with the most. Interestingly enough, this is a bayonet lug, which was put on later. It's been a really impractical thing to have a bayonet on. And then also these sling swivels sometime were put on it too, so you can sling it because it's really heavy. Anybody that wants to can, after we're done talking, can come up and take a look at that. Any questions so far? Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to get clarity on that fort that you said that the Charles had gone up to fight. I didn't quite hear the name of it.
Meigs.
Pardon?
Fort Meigs.
M-E-I-G-S. Okay.
Up near Toledo. Right.
Okay.
Up in that area.
Mm-hmm.
What is Pennsylvania style for a rifle? I don't know.
That's a good question. No, it's just a certain style. If you look at it and you know, they call them Pennsylvania hunters. So you have to think that if you think of some of the plains rifles, they would shoot at greater distances, right?
Right.
So in the woods of Pennsylvania, in the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains, you're probably not taking a shot of more than 75 yards, maybe 100 yards. So you wouldn't need the big long barrel. Plus, if you're going through brushy area, it's just a little bit more convenient to have a shorter weapon.
That
So
makes sense.
Yeah.
It
So that's what they
also
did.
It also had to do with the forestock that they put on the rifles too.
Right.
Many of the Pennsylvania rifles used a very long forestock that went almost to the tip of the barrel.
Oh, some of them are, you're right, some of them are quite beautiful. There were some makers of those. This was pretty utilitarian, right? It's a plain rifle. It's a working man's rifle is what I call it.
It's got a curly cue on it.
It does. Yeah, there's a little bit of scroll work.
Yeah.
And, but it's the Jäger, which was a German word for rifle. It's pretty much a Jäger style. They had shorter rifles. The Germans did, so it's definitely German made, or that influence probably Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So yeah,
Does that rifle have a rifle barrel or is it?
it's right. It's a rifle barrel. It's not a smooth
Rifle
bore.
barrel,
Yeah,
not a smooth bore.
probably about a 45 caliber.
Okay.
So yeah, so some of the so Paul and Alice and the contingent of other French and native relatives, because the French tended to marry into the tribes. They overall got along better with the indigenous peoples than the British did. It was just a style. There was a lot of reasons for that. Number one, it was a personality thing amongst the French, and then also there was never the Indians that didn't look at the French as much of a threat as they did the British, because there weren't as many of them. Now, the French tended to not stay. They would travel, they would trade with the Indians like I just talked about. They would marry into the tribes, they respected them for the most part. And so the Indians didn't have any problem, the chiefs didn't have any problem with them. And you go back to those times, they didn't really, maybe some of them did, but most of them didn't think about the whites taking over all the land. And the French never showed that inclination, where the British proved they did. Of course, the French had their settlements around Kaskaskia, Fort de Char, some other places, but they always invited the native peoples in, and that they just got along with them better. Yes.
All right, another question. When you're talking about Kaskaskia, is that in Illinois?
It is. That's a good question. It's right on the border of Illinois and Missouri. Interestingly enough, so I got this book. This was one that really helped me. This was written, I've got a ton of study material that, of course, I'm not going to lug it all here. But I'm going to talk about that here in a second, because I think it's pretty interesting for anybody that's interested in doing this kind of thing. But this was a writer. Her name was Natalia Belton, and she wrote this book in the 40s, I believe it was. Yes, 1948. And it's about the town of Kaskaskia. And what I try to do when I research things, I try, if you can find books that are out of print, and we'll talk about this one here in a minute, go back to the further back you can go to some of the source material. I just found it's really, of course you can do lazy searches, and of course I use the computer to search out things, but I've also got a ton of books, and because you never know what's going to be put on the internet, right? And she wrote a really interesting book about Kaskaskia and Fort de Char, which is still there, by the way. There was 3 Fort de Chars. The first 2 were made of wood, and they found they were too close to the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi would flood, and the forts would rot. So they built the third and final one out of limestone, because there's a ton of stone around there. But anyway, there's cool pictures of the fort that's still there. I have not made it out there yet, but I'm going to, because Paul and Alice were married in the chapel at the fort, St. Anne's Chapel, which is still there inside the fort. I've actually got their marriage certificate. It's all in French. Pretty cool. I got that from the Catholic Church.
She ever get that black off her face?
Say that again?
Good question.
She ever get that black off her face?
She did, yeah. That's a good question. She probably
She
went
didn't burn.
went right down to the river and washed it off.
She
Yeah.
wore a green dress at the wedding.
Yeah. She did. So she went through quite a bit. She was captured. Her sister was captured. Now I didn't put this in the book. There's been stories that her sister's children were taken also. Well, I have that in the book. But Alice may or may not have had children that were taken and lost somehow. Either the Indians kept them. The Indians tended to do two things. This was kind of their standard operation. When they would raid a settlement or cabins or whatever, they'd kill any fighting age men that they could, and boys. They tended to kill babies. Why they did that was because they didn't want to have to put up with a baby in the wilderness and traveling with a baby. Just the way it was. They would take women, girls, children that were ambulatory, that could walk, and they tended, I don't want to get graphic, but they tended not to rape. At least the Eastern Woodland Indians didn't, the tribes. What they tried to do was bring these people into the tribe willingly, because that's what they wanted. Now, if you didn't want to do that, if you didn't want to marry them, then okay, you get your face painted black and you get burned. So there's your choices.
Unless somebody like Paul comes along.
Unless somebody like Paul happens along and gets you out of your mess. But Alice's sister, her name was Margaret. They called her Margaret Mary. She was taken in the same raid. It's in the book. It's called, chapter 18. It was called the Jackson River Massacre. Was the name that was put to it. And oh shoot, I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't want to misspeak. Here we go. By the time it was over, so this was a raid conducted by the Shawnee and the Delaware. We call them the Delaware. They call themselves the Lenni Lenape tribe. They were the Shawnee called them their grandfather tribe. So anyway, they tended to travel and fight together. By the time it was over, the Indians had killed 13, 9 men, 1 woman, 3 children, and wounded several more. 28 were abducted. And this is the raid I'm talking about, where Alice was taken. 28 were abducted, 24 of them were children, and 4 women, including Alice and her older sister, Margaret Mary Dean Bird, B-Y-R-D. 6 of the 7 Bird children were taken. One named Sarah was away visiting friends at a cabin and was not attacked. Only 3 Indians were known to have been killed. One of them was killed by Alice. She grabbed her, as I mentioned before, her father was a British soldier in New York, and when she left, she got his musket. He gave her his old brown best, like we call them, big British, like 75 caliber, smooth bore, put a big hole in somebody. Well, apparently when the story I got, because I visited, and I'll tell you about that in a second. When they came to get her, she was waiting with the musket, and she killed one of them. Well, they ended up taking her. She got wounded, but her sister was taken, and so what happened to her sister? Nobody knew all these years. Well, I found the book. It's the log of General Bouquet. Has anybody heard of him before, General Bouquet? Mm-hmm. He was a colonel at this time. Oh, here we go. So in the General Thomas Gage, probably any Revolutionary War buffs have heard of Gage. In his papers, it was called, that's at the University of Michigan, which I saw, I got copies of these log books. Colonel Bouquet, it was called The Indian Captives Released by Colonel Bouquet, November 30th, 1764, Clements Library, University of Michigan. So I looked over all that stuff. And it's quite interesting. He was then Colonel Bouquet. So Colonel Bouquet sounds French, but he was Swiss. And he was a professional soldier, and he joined the British Army. And he actually was quite a good man from everything I read about him. Honorable soldier. But he, 1763 or 4, he, all these people who were captured, they were taken by the Indians to their villages right around here, I'm sure. Chillicothe was a big one. They took him into the interior of the Ohio country. Well, General Bouquet, his mission was to get back the captives. So he formed a big army, and this was just after the Indians suffered a big defeat at the Battle of Brushy Creek in Pennsylvania. So they were kind of beaten back, and that was sort of the Indians' MO. They would, if they were high after winning, they were high after winning. If they got their tails whipped, they got their tails whipped, and they tended to kind of go into their little holes for a while. And I talked about brutality, and I don't want to make it all one-sided, because definitely we all know there was enough brutality to go around on all sides. I talked about, the Indians and the kids before, but General Bouquet, he formed a big army, and they marched west into the Ohio country, and from Pennsylvania. And he didn't want to get into a battle with the Indians, but he wanted to show them the force. He had artillery pieces with him. He had a bunch of troops, and they marched slowly, and he sent runners out and met with the chiefs and said, basically, we better have our we better have the white captives back, or we're going to come in, we're going to take care of business. So the Indians brought all the captives who would come. Interestingly enough, a lot of the captives were Indian. It had become part of their tribes, and didn't want to be repatriated. They would run off into the woods. There was babies, or kids that were taken as young children, raised by Indian parents. That's all they knew. So, from what I've read, accounts were really heartbreaking scenes where their kids are just being literally pulled from from their Indian mothers. So brutal stuff. But anyway, General Bouquet, he one of the people that got released was Alice's sister, Mary Margaret. She'd been living with the Shawnee for 7 years at this time. I found her record in General Bouquet's logbook, her name, and also the name of an Indian child that she had, a little girl named Lupa. No record ever had been, so I brought her to life in the book too, and she's actually featured in the second book and the third book I'm working on now. So Nalupa was half Shawnee, she was half white, and Paul and Alice took her. She ended up getting adopted. Unfortunately, Mary Margaret made it back as far as Fort Pitt, and she died at Fort Pitt, because this was in the winter when Bouquet did this, and I theorized, she died of pneumonia. I'm almost positive of it, because she went right into the infirmary there, and she died a few weeks later. So, so that was pretty interesting stuff that I found through research. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that General Bouquet's foray over into Indian country started at Brushy Creek.
Yeah.
Now, Brushy Creek is east of Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Over near Donegal.
Correct. Yeah, he didn't. I didn't mean that he started there. I meant that there was a big battle there.
Yeah.
And the Indians got beaten badly.
Yeah. Well,
so
George Washington was involved in Brushy Creek.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mean that Bouquet was actually involved in the fight, and he may have been. What I'm saying is that the Indians got beaten bad, so what they did was they went back to their villages, right? And they're like, okay, we're done with this for the time being.
Okay.
So that was their psyche at the time. So, yeah, that was one avenue that I did, and I visited the Warm Springs, Virginia Historical Society. Great people. I spent some time out there. They had a bunch of records. They had records of everybody that was taken in the raid near Fort Dunwoody, where Alice was taken. So, so some other resources I used. It's pretty cool, cool little book. So I'm getting more into, in my current book, how they traveled, and the old buffalo traces, right? Probably can't see this one, but people familiar with, I was talking to somebody about limestone and Simon Kenton. Well, Route 68 goes through there and down to Blue Licks. Well, the buffalo traces, of course we know there are bison, but we're going to call them, buffalo is the name that was used. So the buffalo traces, they could be actually 10 to 12 feet deep. and because they were used so. And geologists think that they actually were created probably by mastodons. I found that absolutely fascinating. Like Route 68, it was a buffalo trace, and there's a lot of our roads that were buffalo traces, right? So, so as the millennia go by, they get filled in by dirt and stuff, but originally it could have been 10 to 12 feet deep. And then the buffalo and all those herbivores, what did they do? Well, we know we talk about the salt licks, right? The Battle of Blue Licks and all that. Well, those are all salt licks. So they traveled from salt licks to salt licks, and also to the bluegrass of Kentucky, rich bluegrass, the cane fields. So they went from feeding grounds, my point, and breeding grounds. So the Indians ended up picking up these same trails to a point. They blazed their own, of course, because their trails tended to go towards the white villages, the white forts, where they would do their trading. But for a large part, a lot of them were the old buffalo traces. That's what they followed. So anyway, this is a really cool book that was written at the beginning of, it was 1903, I believe it was, by an author, Archer Butler Hulbert, Hulbert. If anybody's interested in this kind of stuff, it's really cool to read. But he traveled all these traces back around 1900, because a lot of them are gone now. A lot of them are gone when he traveled, but most of them are gone now. They're all paved over, right? Except you can find little sections, like if you go down to Blue Licks, where the Battle of Blue Licks was, down there to State Park, they've got a little section of the buffalo traces. It's not been touched. But anyway, that's kind of cool.
What's that book called? What's that one called?
I'm not sure what that was, how much that was. It wasn't very expensive. It was
What's the
from,
cover of this
title?
one, right, that you're holding?
say again?
What's the title?
Indian
Thoroughfares.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can, I
Okay.
don't know if you want to look at it or anything, but it's just kind of a cool little book, if you like that kind of stuff.
Is that the kind of book that a lot of times you'll find at historical sites? and
Yes, this one
places?
actually, I believe was printed by, I think it was a research, I think it's University of Michigan, but I'm not really
University of
sure.
Michigan Library.
Yeah.
Nice.
Historical societies, libraries, universities, and not only university libraries, but local libraries. We were just talking about the genealogy room in Preble County.
Over in Eaton.
Over in Eaton. It's a fabulous place. A place I really
It's a
love.
separate little library.
It is?
It's not just a corner that says genealogy, it's a separate.
Oh, yeah.
Whole separate library.
Those people are great. And the Kentucky Gateway Museum, if I'm talking to some folks here that've got Kentucky roots, this is a great place to go. This is down in Maysville. You can spend a day down there.
Simon Kenton.
Yeah. And if you like tasting bourbon, you can get a little.
The Bourbon Trail?
You do well. There's
on the Bourbon Trail?
there's a place there called.
It's not on the trail, but
It's
you
not
can.
on the trail,
You
but
can
it's
your own trail.
Yeah. But they've got Pogue's distilleries down there. So you can get a little card and you have to set it up online. But Pogue's distilleries are a cool little place to go. It's been around since around the Civil War. It's a bourbon distillery.
For anyone who hasn't been in Maysville, the old part of Maysville, that's worth the trip because many of the original homes are still there.
Right.
And it's a good trip.
Well-
It's a good trip.
Well, look, go ahead.
Have you seen Washington? That's next.
Yeah, the town of
Maysville?
Washington.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they have old buildings there. And in fact, I never fail being touched by this. They have one of those old kind of fences that the pieces of wood go with all.
Split rail.
Yeah, it was built by slaves.
Well, they've got one of the first post offices in Kentucky is there in Washington. So, interestingly enough, I'm going to jump ahead. Any questions about what we talked about so far? So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. I'm on my third book now, and it's a really interesting period of time. So these folks that we're talking about here, my family, they used bounty land warrants. So talk to somebody about that. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that. We talked about and a lot of our ancestors, people in this room, if you served in the
Revolutionary.
the federal government provided bounty land warrants for those who served in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Indian Wars between 1775 and 1855. It was first offered as an incentive to serve in the military and later as a reward for service. Bounty land warrants could be claimed by veterans and their heirs. So, was also interesting to me, which I had to research some. It's like, okay, did that just mean federal control, or what about the states? Because if you think back to those times, there wasn't much of a federal government. Well, there was kind of a reciprocal thing between New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, that the bounty land warrants would be good in Virginia and those states. So who can tell me something about Kentucky? How do I put this? Well, Kentucky was a part of Virginia up until it became a state in 1793, I think.
Right.
So it was District of Kentucky, Commonwealth of Virginia. So
They're both Commonwealths, aren't they?
Yeah.
correct. So that I think Kentucky became a Commonwealth because basically they took the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia and just scratched it out and put Kentucky.
Kentucky.
Kentucky. So a lot of you probably know this too, but Ohio was settled before Kentucky. Or, I'm sorry, Kentucky was settled before Ohio.
Right.
And why was that?
Because of the Indians.
Because of the Indians. And the Indians lived in Ohio. Now you're going to find some historians, and I'm not a professional historian, but I can kind of figure things out. And they'll tell you now, there's some dispute whether the Indians had permanent villages or not in Kentucky. I don't believe they did, and some of the original historians don't believe they did, and the people that live back there don't believe they did. What they did was Kentucky was the hunting grounds, and tribes, it was sort of a neutral zone. Tribes from the south, the Cherokee, tribes from the north, the Shawnee, they would go to Kentucky because of the bluegrass and just the game that was in Kentucky. And so that's why it was settled first, because guys like Herod and Boone and those folks could move in, set up their forts, and not leave. And that's what whites were really good at, not leaving. So the Indians tended to get frustrated. I was doing some training after I retired from the PD. I got to travel around Kentucky, really cool. And then I was at Stanford, Kentucky. Anybody heard of Stanford? Just a little town. They got a fort there. It's not too far from Boonesboro. Stanford got its name because they had a fort, and the Indians laid siege to it for a very long time. They tried, but the fort just wouldn't give in. So Stanford got its name. What the guy told me was in Kentucky-ese, so meaning the way Kentuckians speak, because it's a standing fort, so Stanford. So that's how Stanford, kind of a little aside, got its name. And but anyway, the Indians would get frustrated. Eventually, they'd leave. They couldn't starve you out, and they'd wait for you to come out and try to go get water or wood if you didn't have a spring that ran through your stockade or through your stockade or your little fort. But anyway, this was a really neat book. So my family ended up in northern Kentucky at a place called Cabin Creek, which was in Mason County, Kentucky, and Maysville. Maysville's original name was Limestone. Limestone was a big jumping off point, so flatboats would leave Pittsburgh and they'd float down the Ohio River downstream. Flatboats were a one-way trip from the east to the west, because that's the way the river flowed. You weren't going upstream in a flatboat. Maybe a keel boat with some work, but not flatboats. So they build these flatboats, and a lot of settlers would build them themselves, and they'd float their families and some livestock down the river. You guys, everybody knows this, but still, it's still interesting stuff to think about. And one of the stopping points was Limestone. Well, they'd go down that old the current day Route 68, which was called the Limestone Road for a while. It had several names, but then they'd travel down into the interior of Kentucky, down to Lexington, Frankfort, which were the Paris, which were kind of the big areas, right? Or so most of them would drop off there. They'd Some of them stayed in northern Kentucky. My family had bounty land warrants to a place called Cabin Creek, which was in Mason County, Kentucky, but then later Mason County broke off into several parts into Lewis County. And I'm getting ready to go down and do some research at Lewis County Historical Society soon. I visited Cabin Creek. They built, they had their cabins there, they had sawmills. They were pretty enterprising. The flatboats, interestingly enough, they would get abandoned a lot of times, or they used the wood to build their homes, right?
Yeah.
When Fort Washington was built, everybody's familiar with Fort Washington in Cincinnati.
Yes,
That was built, most of the wood was used from flatboats.
wow.
They're like, hey, there's all these flatboats that have been abandoned up around just 40 miles up the river at Limestone. Let's float those on down here. So they floated them on down and used a lot of the wood to build Fort Washington. And it was actually an extensive fort. It wasn't like a little rugged, took up a whole current day city block, and it sat right there in downtown Cincinnati, right, it faced the Licking River. And then the flatboats later on, and my family got involved in this somewhat too, they load up goods, farm goods, tobacco, Kentucky tobacco, burley tobacco, whiskey, pork products, things that they couldn't get a whole lot of down like in New Orleans. So they'd float those down to Ohio, down to Mississippi, and they'd stop at New Orleans. And then New Orleans, a lot of the houses, especially the ones along the waterfront, were built from those flatboats. And then how'd they get back? They came back on the Natchez Trail.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother thing. I want to get into that big time too.
Interesting.
I really want to research that, because I know that my family, and probably a lot of folks here, their ancestors, who didn't even know it, they'd come back 1,200 miles on the Natchez Trail. And what they do is they'd use some of that money they got, they'd buy horses that were for sale down around New Orleans, and they'd travel back.
What's the name of that trail again?
Natchez.
Natchez.
Natchez, okay. Bloody Trail.
Bloody Trail. And there was a lot of ambushes on that trail. There was highwaymen waiting to rob you. I think that would be a really interesting story myself, traveling along the Natchez Trail or something.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You were talking about the battle warrants.
Bounty
for
lane
taking the
warrants.
land. Was that related at all? It seems to me I heard something about, with the Revolutionary War, people coming back to Ohio specifically to get land for serving. And I think, my connections may not be right, but I thought something this idea of like Washington Courthouse, they called it a courthouse, was kind of connected to some of those. Do you know?
I'm not really sure about that, but the name Washington obviously became popular because
Right.
because
And courthouse, I call it courthouse,
Right.
it's just down the road.
I know. I don't know about that. I know that, okay, so where I'm at right now, with the book that I'm just finishing up, is around 1787, 1788. And go ahead, sir. I'm sorry, I didn't want
Just point towards me.
to. Yeah.
Rocky Fork Lake covers a lot of bounty property.
That's it?
Yeah, a lot of Revolutionary War men got property, many acres in the Hillsborough area is
That's
covered
where
by
I'm
it.
from.
Yeah. My ex's family, my ex's grandfather, the state would come down with a trunk load of money and whiskey, and
That's why it's an X.
and when they would leave, they would have more of his property,
Right.
Oh, good.
which is now under Rocky Fork Lake.
Oh, thank you for that information.
That's kind of cool, and I know I'm getting off track a little bit here, but in my first book, I kind of, and I want to write a biography on a guy by the name of Pierre Chartet, who I wrote a chapter about, because to me, he was a really interesting guy. He was French. His father was French. His mother was Shawnee, and he pretty much took up the Indian way of life. He became he became a village chief, and he was in Pennsylvania. And I'm circling back to what you just talked about, how they would have the whiskey and then they'd end up with less land. Well, that's what the whites did to the Indians,
Yeah.
because the Indians, the native folks just didn't have any, they didn't have the resistance, the tolerance to alcohol, especially strong spirits, and they became drunken fools. And I read this from accounts from the time. An otherwise honorable, sober Indian man would sell off everything just for a bottle of hooch, right? So Pierre Chartier, why I find him so interesting is he was completely against alcohol. He forbid it in his village. He got a bunch of other Indian chiefs to sign on to this, and Governor Penn at the time in Pennsylvania signed warrants against Chartier, some made-up charges, because he was stirring up, not for the fight, but he was cutting into the trade of whiskey, rum mostly, to the Indians, and they were getting wise to the tactics, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So he put warrants on. So he ended up fleeing with his people, and he ended up along the Ohio River out in current day Indiana. But it's the same thing, you know. I mean, they would dupe these guys, and they would get them to sell over their land or whatever they wanted for alcohol. So I mean, I think that was just an interesting thing. Kind of went off on a side trail there just a little bit.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's me. But yeah. So now my story, where I'm writing about now, we're at the period of 1787, 1788, and that's when the Northwest Ordinance came about.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting piece. I was going to bring it with me, but if you haven't looked over that, you can find it online. It's a pretty interesting thing to read about. In some ways, it's far-reaching. Abraham Lincoln called it probably the most important piece of legislation that Congress ever put down, but because it established government, it established the current states of what? Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, what am I forgetting? Michigan?
Michigan.
That was part of the old Northwest Territory, right?
All right.
It was broken into those states.
All right.
They guaranteed freedom of religion. They guaranteed, well, there was no slavery. Let's get back to that, though. What they also did, something they would do, that didn't, no slavery, schools. But here's the other side. Here's the double edge when I'm, in my opinion, about the Northwest Ordinance. Nobody told the Indians. So,
This is what we're doing, but
yeah, this is what we're doing. So, but they found out. And if you're familiar with the Northwest Indian Wars, which basically went on from what, 1789 to well, heck, you can actually say they went on through the War of 1812. We've got Blue Jacket and Little Turtle at the beginning, and then we've got Tecumseh
yes.
towards the other part of it. So those people were not going to get pushed any further, right? They just, this is Ohio. We're not going. Where are we going to go? So that's what they fought. This is the line. We've been pushed, and this is where we're at now. The other thing about the new Northwest Ordinance was it banned slavery, but it did not ban slave catchers from going into the territory to get their property back.
Oh, yeah.
So that was one thing. Also, what ticked the settlers off, guys like Kenton and Boone, probably my family, was they established that, well, now, because Kenton was big about if people were taken or the Indians would come down and steal horses in northern Kentucky, go across the Ohio River, because the Ohio River usually was only about this deep, right? So they could wade across it or trump across it.
It's different now.
Oh yeah, because of all the damming, obviously. But Kenton would track them down or try to track them down. Well, Northwest Ordinance said you can no longer do that. Whites can no longer pursue Indians into Ohio. That ticked them off. They probably just violated that rule and just went ahead and did it anyway. But so there were some different things about the Northwest Ordinance. Pretty interesting. But the big thing was, I think it sparked the Northwest Indian Wars. And if you're not familiar with that, I have to become a whole lot more familiar with it. The United States Army took its biggest beating by the Indians during that war. General St. Clair.
Yes.
In Eaton.
In Eaton, yeah. Pivot Park there.
Well, that's where Fort St. Clair was, right?
Yeah,
So you
right.
built these chain of forts Fort Washington, Fort Hamilton, Fort St. Clair. What's the other forts? But they went all the way up, right?
They went up
Lawrence.
to Indiana.
Correct.
Fort
Well,
Wayne and.
the big battle was further north.
Right,
it
it
was-
was Anthony Wayne.
Right.
Fallen timbers.
But there was,
Well, Fallen Timbers came later. Let's hold that thought.
there was like Greenville, you went.
Greenville, right, the
just
Greenville
go straight
Treaty.
up like 127, and that's
Correct.
the whole line where the folk.
Right. If you go up 127 far enough, well, then you finally get to the point where St. Clair stretched his army out so far, didn't have didn't have scouts. The Indians were building up, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, and some people came and told him, and he was like, yeah, so. So what happened was they got swarmed, and they got their tails handed to them. The American Army did, and there was a lot of finger pointing around it. St. Clair was no coward, but he was in bad shape at the time. I think he suffered from gout really bad. Some accounts where he was crawling around the battlefield because he couldn't walk. Well, the Indians trailed them all the way back to, I don't know how far south they came, but the stragglers came into Fort Washington in Cincinnati, and I believe there was like over 800 or 900 American soldiers and militia were killed by the Indians. And a lot of camp followers, because you had camp followers, women and so forth that were following them along. So they got massacred, they got beaten too.
Do you think the reason we don't know much about that is because the United States forces got beat and they didn't really put that in history books?
There's a book out now about that.
Yeah, there are books about it, there are things about it. I just think people, for lack of a better term, unless folks like us, they just don't care. I mean, that's like, it's like, so what? It's ancient history to them.
Well, it's formative for us. I have a sad news to report about the St. Clair Park, the big whispering oak that's been there since
Yeah.
1700. Do you remember Hurricane Helene back in September?
Really?
Remember that Friday where it was so bad?
Yeah.
Well, that tree went over and it
Did
broke
it?
it open. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The good thing is they had a second oak that they planted like in the 70s, so it's like growing, but that big one's gone.
Because that's right near where the soldiers' cemetery is.
Yeah, that those guys were the Kentucky militia.
Right, they were killed there. Oh, I was just up there, a few months ago. It's such a cool place.
The good thing is they have pictures, but I felt sad. I saw it. I felt sad. I thought, wow.
Well,
Well, trees are not forever.
no, they sure
I mean, this one was standing there a good long time.
Yeah, they say that one was probably standing during the battle.
Yeah.
When it occurred.
Oh, it was.
Talking about somebody mentioned Marietta and the first settlement in Ohio, right?
Right.
Yep.
And then the fort that was there, Fort Harmer. Again, I'm getting into this in the book that I'm working on now. Pretty interesting stuff. So Fort Harmer was there with the first American regiment. That was their number. Our whole military at the time, I think Harmer was the commanding officer. He was the highest ranking officer, and he was a lieutenant colonel, and 30-some years old. And that was the extent of our army at the time. It was just a few hundred men and officers. And they were at most of them were at Fort Harmer. Some were at Fort Steuben. They were spread around a little bit. But Fort Harmer at Marietta, before Marietta came, Fort Harmer, I think, was built in 1786. The mission of the soldiers at Fort Harmer was not to protect the whites. The mission of the soldiers at Fort Harmer was to keep the whites out of Ohio, because this was before the Northwest Ordinance. And whites were forbidden, technically, from settling in Ohio. So the soldiers would actually go around, the ones they could find, they'd evict them and they'd burn their cabins.
What year?
What's that?
What year was?
They're around 1786, 87, until the Northwest Ordinance came around. And the Northwest Ordinance didn't mean, oh, we can go sell it willy-nilly. The Congress did that because they wanted the money. They were broke. So they sold like Sims, like the Sims land purchase, some other ones. So you had these people who made a lot of money. Some of them went broke, but they sold land to these settlers, right, in Ohio, these tracts of land if you didn't have the bounty land warrants. So that's when it opened up. think that was all I was going to cover on that stuff. Some other interesting side things through this whole expedition of mine was I found, I showed a couple people this. So now there's a few people, modern day writers, but this goes back much further than modern day writers. Alan Eckert wrote about Marmaduke Swearingen. There's an author named Robert Bennett in the 40s who wrote a small book about Blue Jacket. My ancestor, my third great uncle, a guy named Thomas Jefferson Larsh, he was an editor, he was a lawyer, and he was an editor up in Eaton at the Eaton Register. This is him here. He was a big history buff too. Apparently loved the Indian way of life because he named one of his sons Blue Jacket. And unfortunately, Blue Jacket, Larsh, when he was 18 years old during the Civil War, he was captured somewhere in, thank you very much, you read my mind. He was captured in, I think in North Carolina. Anyway, he went to, he was a Union soldier. He was taken to Andersonville prison and he died there.
Oh, God.
If anybody has read about that hellhole.
That was terrible.
But he's now buried up in Eaton in one of the cemeteries there. I visited his grave. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson Larsh also did some research, and it was family history and family story. So Paul and Sarah had one son, Charles. Remember we talked about that. I'm sorry, Paul and Alice had one son.
No, I was thinking, who's Sarah?
Well, I'm about to tell you.
Alice would get you for that.
Paul and Alice had one son, Charles. He married a woman by the name of Sarah Swearingen. Sometimes the van is put on there, but mostly they just called them Swearingen. They were a Dutch, French, German, Dutch family. So John Swearingen served during the Revolution. He was a captain. He was actually good friends with George Washington. He was a surveyor. John was my fifth great-grandfather, so that's 7 generations back. So he had a daughter. Well, they had like 12 kids, Sarah, the Swearingens did, and most of them lived to adulthood, unbelievably. But they had a daughter, like a younger daughter, her name was Sarah. Well, Charles Larsh married Sarah Swearingen. And when they were in Pennsylvania, Sarah's brother, Marmaduke Swearingen, Duke Swearingen, was captured by the Shawnee. Sometimes if you read about it, it'll say it was in West Virginia. Well, West Virginia didn't exist then, but they actually lived right down along the Cheat River. And this guy brought the family story to light that actually Duke Swearingen was the war chief, Blue Jacket.
Yeah.
Now that story was picked up by Alan Eckert, by Bennett. It's been in our family for forever, and it's been in the family since that time. As a matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson Larsh was friends with Blue Jacket's grandson, who was a reverend in the Oklahoma Territory on the Shawnee Indian Reservation, and they visited each other and they considered each other cousins.
Wow.
So that was going on. There's documentation of that. But most recently, the Shawnee tribe got ticked because they didn't want their famous war chief being a Caucasian. So they did this DNA testing, and if you look at this, you can see it's like a lot of people say, "Yep, that's been proven. He's not. Blue Jacket wasn't," because they did some DNA testing. My question is, who did they DNA test, right?
Yeah.
So you might have somebody with the last name Blue Jacket, because there are a lot of them especially out in the Oklahoma reservation. But that doesn't prove their direct lineage to the war chief. We don't know. We don't know who the fathers were of all these. Those are what I'm trying to say delicately. So I go with the family history story. I believe he was, and because it's been around for so long, you just didn't make up the story like, "Yep, our son got captured and he was a Blue Jacket."
Like you didn't
know that right away anyway.
Right, exactly. And it wasn't popular, right? It wasn't like romanticized like we do today. Blue Jacket he was a war chief. You didn't want to be white and captured by, run into Blue Jacket. So it wasn't something you bragged about, what I'm trying to say. So that's kind of a neat thing. I write a chapter about that, and it became kind of controversial. Especially I got a couple of friends who are scholars, and one especially, he took exception with it. I'm like, well, all I'm doing is I'm relaying the story. That's what I try to be as a storyteller and entertain people and base it all on fact. Everything I put in here, other than some of the characters that I had to make up, but the main characters are real. The things that happened are real. And I not only went from one source, like I told you before, I cross-referenced all these things. And if I wasn't sure about it, a place or whatever, I just didn't put it in the book or books. So based on true stories, some of the characters, and if you want to get with me sometime after you read them, was like, because I've got one particularly favorite character people have asked me, it's like, was he real? I'm like, nah, I kind of made him up. So that's about it. Any questions or stuff we want to talk about more along these lines? Is that interesting? Do people find that?
Very interesting, very.
Yeah.
Oh,
What's really interesting, now we'll make a day trip over many of these areas that these frontiersmen traveled.
oh yeah.
Absolutely.
And we figured that they were traveling mostly by foot,
Exactly.
mostly on foot.
On foot, yes.
And their journeys sometimes took them months.
Exactly.
Yes.
You bring up a good point. So then, where I'm at now, the book I just wrote, which I believe I'm going to call Buffalo Traces and Rivers, a story of 18th century America. And I think that's what I'm going to call it. And I think the artwork's going to be really good. It's going to be, it's going to show the Ohio River at Cabin Creek with some buffalo crossing the river. Because right there at Cabin Creek, that was actually a big buffalo crossing. They found their places usually where it was more shallow, and that's where they crossed. And they would cross into Cabin Creek. There was, which is why Simon Kenton was so hot on being up in northern Kentucky, because he wanted the canebrakes. It was a big thing, looking for the canebrakes. Guess where the buffalo and the elk and all that would be, because they fed in the canebrakes, and they fed in the bluegrass. And so yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. But my family ended up coming. Some of them came by flatboat, but then Paul and the rest of them came overland on by trail, and they did that so they could drive. Because if you think about a flatboat, you could probably only put maybe a couple cows or a mule on it. You couldn't put a whole bunch of livestock, depending on the size of the boat. Some of them were quite big, but most of them weren't that big. And so they drove they drove probably about 12, 15 head of cattle, some mules, things like that, overland. And I figured out the route that they came, which is kind of interesting, but came across Pennsylvania, then they followed the Ohio River down, and then actually ended up cutting into southern Ohio, and then crossing back over around Cabin Creek where they settled.
You make the trip, for example, you make the trip from here to Maysville
Right.
Yeah,
in a couple of hours.
exactly. Or even if you went down to, I guess they call them state resorts down in Kentucky, the Blue Lake Battlefield. That's not much farther. I mean, it's good. What he's talking about with the trail and the buffalo, it's really neat.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's why news. I mean, and how long did it take? Something happened in Europe. I mean, shoot, the French and Indian War ended, which actually was called the 7 Years' War. It ended, let's say, I believe it was in March, but we didn't find out over here until August that the war was even over, right? Because it took, on a good trip, 6 weeks to get across the Atlantic Ocean. So it took 6 weeks. sometimes longer, and that's if it was a good trip. So information only traveled as fast as a boat or a horse.
Right.
And interestingly enough, I don't want to. This was a really piece of cool documentation I found. So again, I'm jumping ahead to the book I'm working on now, but they traveled. I say they. My family basically traveled along the Forbes Road, and there's two big roads, military roads through Pennsylvania. The first was Braddock's Road. Everybody's heard of Braddock's, General Braddock's Road. And then there was Forbes Road. And basically they paralleled each other. Forbes was just a little bit easier to, not that it was easy, a little bit easier to transverse than Braddock's Road was. But civilians, of course, used it too. And they would travel from Pennsylvania or Kentucky, or Pennsylvania across, and they would leave the Forbes Road and they'd travel down the Great Wagon Road, right? And everybody's familiar with the Great Wagon Road. It's the road. It actually went from. So if you think Philadelphia, I think I said Pittsburgh before. I didn't mean to say that. Philadelphia, and then like Lancaster, that area of Pennsylvania, Gettysburg, which didn't exist then. It was Gettysburg.
Gettysburg.
And it was just a little bitty crossroads, but then they would turn left, go south, cross a little bit of Maryland, and then down into northern Virginia, and then they'd follow the Great Wagon Road, which thousands and thousands of immigrants used, and then they'd get down to that, and then they would travel the Great Wagon Road, if you think the Shenandoah Valley, and then they would cross over, and they'd go to the Wilderness Trail, Boone's Wilderness Trail, and into Kentucky. So that was kind of a big route too. So two main ways you came. You came by flatboat, and you either went down to Limestone, Maysville, and you got off, or you took that all the way down to the falls of the Ohio, that's a whole different story. That's an interesting look, where Louisville is now.
Yeah.
And a lot of boats got broken up there, or you portaged around it, or you tried to get through the falls, which is actually, if you're familiar with it, it wasn't really a big waterfall like the Niagara Falls. It's just a series of falls, some of them, but try to get in the boat down that, right? Unless you went down to shoot. So, but anyway, then they disembark around present day Louisville, Louisville, which was named after. Yeah, we do that in Louisville, but you know who it was named after? King Louis.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, blue.
Yeah. So Louisville.
Louisiana.
But anyway, so I mean, those were the ways you got into the territory, was either by those trails or by the boats. And I'll wind this up here. This is pretty interesting. So doing all the research and told you about Charles and Alice, and Charles and Sarah, Paul and Alice's son Charles married Sarah. Sarah was my fourth great-grandmother, so that's 6 generations back. Sometime around, they fought in the War of 1812. Sometime in the early 1800s, they left Kentucky, and I'm finding out it was because they were opposed to slavery. And Kentucky was a slave state, and Ohio wasn't, and that's why a lot of folks left Kentucky and decided to move to Ohio. And the way you find out, you can find out if your ancestors were involved. I believe they were involved in the Underground Railroad before there was such a thing. And the way you trace those things down is the churches they belong to. There's certain churches now. Eaton, Ohio, was a big area for the Underground Railroad, and they would travel around up and down the creek beds. The escaped slaves would, and there was ways that they found out what houses they could go to. Signals, things that were left outside. Sometimes it was something like a certain blanket with a certain weave on it. There was just certain signals where they knew what house to go to. But that requires more research. But what I was going to get to was Sarah Swearingen, who married Charles Larsh. She lived to be almost 89 years old. And through this research, I found her grave, which is in Preble County, Kentucky, or Preble County, Ohio, and just outside of Eaton. She died in 1849. She was born in 1760. And she's buried there. And I found it, was able to find her grave. Went there with the folks from the Preble County Historical Society. Got a lot of family graves there. This one is, I don't know if you can see that gravestone, that's in great shape.
It's Larsh.
Yeah, so it's John Larsh, who was, this is from 1840. So some of the original, some settlers in Preble County that were my family. But the cool thing about this was I never would have found her grave if I wasn't doing the research for these books. And I was able to reclaim her stone and get it cleaned up. But then going through the, this was kind of cool. I kind of like to feel this was her reaching out, just, you know, whether it was or not, I don't know. But anyway, I was at the Preble County, at the genealogy room, and I'm going through a ton, I got a ton of stuff here, and I didn't bring them. I didn't bring a quarter of it. This is all receipts that were entered when she died of her possessions. But one of the things I found, I got to hold the original documents. What I found was the bill of sale for this headstone. And it didn't get, so in 1849 when she died, the folks from Preble County Historical Society said 1849, she probably died from the cholera epidemic. So there was a big cholera epidemic where like a third of the population of Eaton died. And it would have taken the elderly, obviously. So whether that's what she died, they felt pretty strongly she did. But anyway, in 1851, her estate was settled. And this is the receipt for that gravestone that I just showed you. So it says, Sarah Larsh to John D. Miller to set one gravestone for said deceased. Put and stand on grave, you stand it up, $33. Which was a good deal of money back then. And then receive the payment
That's
on the
highway.
above account, April 25th, 1851. So anyway, I thought that was kind of cool. It's like not only did I find a gravestone, I found the bill of sale for the whole thing. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
yes,
Are you familiar with Rankin House down in Ripley?
yeah,
That was a big point of when the slaves came across the Ohio River.
yeah. That's a whole interesting thing. I got to get into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting stuff. So this was so I visited Cabin Creek, and we talked about ways to find things. And obviously, historical societies, if you reach out to them, they've always been great to me when I'm doing research for books. But then also old newspaper articles. This is from the archives of the Kentucky Gateway Museum. And it talks about the Cabin Creek War Road. So there was actually an Indian war road. They called them war roads, that they traveled to fight one another. It went right through the territory. But then I was able to find another news article of a cabin that was, which I've yet to visit. I couldn't get into the property, but it was a cabin of one of my ancestors that was still standing down there, so I wouldn't do that. So it's kind of cool, you know. If anybody's interested in doing this kind of stuff, I mean, I certainly don't make myself any expert. I'm just pretty tenacious, and I've got that kind of mind, you know, to do the investigative stuff. But it's interesting because when you think one door, I've talked to a lot of people about this. It's like, well, I can't find. You know, this is my relative and this is where it ends. Not necessarily. If you start looking at documentation, look at who they were with. Who did they associate themselves with, right? So then you can take that person, like there's a family Truax that I found. Well, when I run into a dead end for my own family, I found that, well, Wilson was another name that they were close to. Well, then I start researching them. Well, then when you start researching them, you'll circle back and you might find some information about your family. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does.
So that's just a little tip. If you're doing some of this genealogy, and there's probably people in this room that know a whole lot more about it than I do, don't just don't stop when you think you're at an impasse, because you can find these things. You just have to dig for them. and make these phone calls, and then it's like all of a sudden, one thing leads to another. I found really good letters. There were some people that did this stuff back in the 50s and 60s, where they corresponded with each other about this. They were interested in the family stuff before I was born in the 50s, and they would pay people to go and do these sorts of things. You can find those letters at places like the genealogy room in Preble County, or if your family's from Kentucky, go to the Gateway Museum, because they not only have stuff around Maysville, they got all kinds of Kentucky history there. And if they don't have it, they can point you in the right direction. So if you're interested in that stuff, there's some really good avenues to do. So,
That's great.
I know I've talked more than I've talked in like the last week, so I hope I didn't bore you too much.
No, it was very good.
One last thing, this was a cool book too. I love this book. This was written in 1912. It's called History of Lewis County, Kentucky. And this is written by a pastor, Reverend O.J. Reagan, R-A-G-A-N, from Cincinnati. And he, this is in there, kind of a smart looking chap. He actually was able to interview, if you think this was 1912, he was able to interview some of the old timers. So he got first accounts, or at least sometimes second accounts of their children, things that would have been lost to history. But when I did my descriptions of like stuff around what did Mason County, Kentucky look like, it doesn't look now like what it did then. Maybe some things, but you think about these old growth. I know I'm going to shut up here in a second, but this is really interesting. Old growth trees. Whoever thinks about those sorts of things, right?
Right.
If you see these old growth forests, the trees that these people had to take down around here,
They were huge.
they were huge. They were 12, 14 feet around. Okay, they weren't what we think of as a big tree. Now there still are some old growth forests you can find, and you can find these old, like in Houston Woods, they've still got some old growth trees in there. But they had. How did they take these trees down? Lots of different ways. One way was they girded them. They tightly put a band around the bottom of them, and the tree would die, and would eventually fall over. But then they had all these stumps, and I always tell my wife, it's like when you go, especially these old fields, like if you look some of these old farm fields, they've been around for a couple hundred years, especially the bottom land around the rivers. You see those fields that are clear now. Thanks some farmer that had to do the hard work, because you talk about hard work getting stumps up. Anybody's ever tried to do that with modern equipment? Digging and chopping, and cutting and trying to get the roots out, and just those little things like that. Let alone feeding and all the things that went around with. But anyway, Reagan did a really good job, and he did great descriptions on Kentucky. And we talk about running into those dead ends, and this is going to be the last thing, I promise you. So one entry he made in there, a horse mill was started by Mr. Swearingen, and a grist mill on Cabin Creek by Swearingen. So when we're talking about Swearingen, we're talking about John Jr. I found his grave. He's my fourth great granduncle. He's buried down there. But he had this grist and sawmill. Who knows what a horse mill is?
That's a,
Horsepower? Is it horsepower?
Correct.
but it's a couple of millstones with a big pole extending out from the top stone.
Right.
And you harness a horse to the end of that, and the horse walks in, or mule,
Wow.
Right.
walks in a continuous circle.
Correct.
Wow.
And why did they do that?
Well, they were grinding corn or
Right.
wheat.
But a lot of these were by streams, right? But what's the deal with streams? They don't always run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they'd use the horses.
Right. Yeah.
Correct. So he got it, and you got it too.
Wow.
So that's interesting to me. It's like, okay, that's pretty ingenious right there. Pretty cool. But anyway, through this book, I was able to trace down where one of my ancestors had it, and then I went down there and I talked to some folks in the area. It's like, oh yeah, Swearingen Mill. I know where that's at. And so he directed me where it was, and pictures of the old mill, just stuff like that I found in a resource book. that was written in 1912. Perhaps there was more stone fence on Cabin Creek than any other creek in the county of its drainage. It's because of all the limestone that was around there, and that's why limestone was named limestone, because of all the limestone around that part of Kentucky. Anyway, I'm done talking now.
We've seen the outdoor dramas, Tecumseh and Blue Jacket.
Blue Jacket was shut down because the Shawnee Nations threatened them with lawsuits.
Really?
Right.
Really? I saw it once, but even this past summer, we went to see Tecumseh and I hear all those names.
I know, isn't it cool?
Yeah, that, to go there, and now I'm here in Franklin, Ohio, hearing those names. That's cool.
I want to thank you all for coming and supporting our event today. Here at the Historical Society of Franklin, we're trying to bring some really good events at no charge. We're planning next year's. Follow us on Facebook so you can keep up to date with the activities. We have memberships to join so you can get our newsletters. I can't thank Jeffrey enough for coming. This was fascinating. Absolutely. And don't forget, your local museums are a great resource. We have genealogy help here, just a wealth of information as you're researching things. But again, thank you all. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.